When I was comparing Marvel to DC in a couple of videos, it really felt like it was unfair. Not because of the number of films produced or the fact that Marvel is such better organized structure. It's not fair just because Marvel is doing so well and DC is doing so poorly. It felt like a cage match between Chris Hemsworth and that toothless kid from Stranger Things. So, what about comparing two universes that are not completely falling apart, both attempting to revitalize their respective franchises and both, interestingly enough, suffering from the same problems? Let me caution you, before you assume anything about why I think these franchises are suffering, please listen to the entire video. I promise this is not an anti-social justice warrior or anti-liberal video. However, leading up to my conclusions, I have to lay some groundwork that will cover some of the social justice warrior / liberal objections that many have had. With that said, let's move on to today's episode of A Tale of Two Universes. I present to you Star Trek versus Star Wars. Before we get started, as always, I want to thank you for watching the videos. You guys are the very reason that I do this. It's a lot of fun, but if nobody was watching it, well, there wouldn't be much point. So I do ask you to like, subscribe, and hey, leave a comment if you feel like there's some way that I can improve the show, or if you just want to argue with me, as many of you have on some of my recent videos. Also, if you do really like what you see, please consider supporting me on Patreon. If I can get enough support from Patreon, I'll be able to dedicate more time to these videos and be able to put them up more frequently, which is my ultimate goal. First, in the interest of fairness and full disclosure, if at any time from 1977 to 2016 you were to ask me which is better, Star Wars or Star Trek, I would have answered without hesitation, Star Trek, of course. Now, you may note that I did say up till 2016. Today, I'm honestly torn between the two. If you were to ask me which has been better, I would probably argue Star Trek. If you ask me which is better, I would likely say Star Wars. And if you were to ask me which is likely going to be better in the future, well, I really don't know. Now, as of this writing, it's still 2 days out, so perhaps when I see The Last Jedi, I will change my mind. But right now, I'm honestly becoming a bit pessimistic as to the future of my two favorite sci-fi franchises of all time. Star Trek and Star Wars have always been distinct and different. Star Wars is focused on fantasy, wish fulfillment, and the classic theme of the hero's journey and good versus evil. Star Trek, on the other hand, has always been about the future progress of mankind, overcoming what we are to become something better, working together in a variety of adverse conditions, and using our diversity as a strength to prevail. Both Star Wars and Star Trek seem now to be run by people that do not understand what their brand has been about and what has made it successful. Star Trek has always had a progressive message of tolerance and diversity as being the ultimate virtue of the Federation. The Federation is the ruling government of the 23rd and 24th centuries. Starfleet is the military force within the Federation and has exploration and research divisions as well. In the 23rd century, the ultimate expression of this is the Constitution-class starship. With a crew of over 400, it had weapons unmatched by anyone in the known galaxy, but also supported state-of-the-art research labs and scanning equipment for exploration. Of the 12 Constitution-class ships, the Enterprise, as captained by James T. Kirk, was the most famous, and of course, was the subject of the original Star Trek television series, as well as the Star Trek animated series, as well as the first 6 and the last 3 Star Trek films. There's Captain Kirk and the Enterprise have also been the subject of a plethora of novels, comic books, etc. The only problem with Star Trek was its creator, Gene Roddenberry, did not approve of several key factors. While the Federation was portrayed as being a socialist capitalism hybrid representative republic, which, among other things, held religious tolerance as one of its core beliefs, Gene Roddenberry wanted it to be portrayed as a purely communistic system with no religion because man had evolved beyond the need for God or gods. Gene also opposed the idea that Starfleet was the military. Let that sink in for a moment. And yes, there are still debates in Trek fandom as to whether or not Starfleet is in fact the military of the Federation. As Star Trek matured, it's gone back and forth a bit on this. And quite frankly, it's rather laughable that in Star Trek Into Darkness, Scotty quit Starfleet because Kirk allowed a new experimental torpedo to be loaded on the ship, and it appeared that they were being sent on a military mission.
There are plenty of straws. How about Starfleet confiscating my transwarp equation, and now some madman's using it to hop across the galaxy? Where'd you think he got it from?
Our orders, Scotty.
That's what scares me. This is clearly a military operation. Is that what we are now? Because I thought we were explorers.
Sign for the torpedoes, that's an...
Right, well, you leave me no choice but to resign my duties.
So, Scotty objects to the old weapons of mass destruction already aboard the Enterprise being replaced with new weapons of mass destruction because that would make this a military operation while serving in the military. Scotty may have had a point if the Enterprise did not already sport heavy armaments, but it did. This anti-military sentiment makes absolutely no sense, and even if you are not into supporting the military and you want your liberal ideas to be embedded into Star Trek, then if you want to avoid the military, then the show or film should not take place on the Federation flagship, a term which, by the way, is a military term. Nobody on the show should have weapons, the ships should not be armed, but hey, whatever. Now, in an attempt to get Star Trek relaunched on television, we see them attempt to push the liberal agenda even further. So we get a show that features, in the first season, anything but a cisgendered white male. Unless, of course, he's set up to be an untrustworthy character like Captain Lorca. You may think I'm going to go on this anti-liberal tirade, but that's not my problem with Star Trek Discovery. We'll come back to that in a moment. Meanwhile, in the other universe, Star Wars started out as a simple adaptation of Joseph Campbell's The Hero with a Thousand Faces, with stylistic cues being borrowed from World War II dogfighting films such as The Dam Busters, mixed with Flash Gordon, and then toss in some Akira Kurosawa-style samurai in the middle of it for good measure. The result was spectacular, to say the least. Interestingly enough, the only problem with Star Wars in the beginning was kind of the same core problem as Star Trek. Its creator, George Lucas. If you could watch the original cut of Star Wars, it was a mess. If to really appreciate how much of a mess it was, I would recommend a short documentary you can see here on YouTube about how the editor saved Star Wars. Put a link in the description below so you can check it out. George Lucas is not a talented filmmaker. He is visionary when it comes to visual effects, and he came up with a brilliant idea for a universe to build a story in. But as a director, you got to be real. He was below average. If you disagree with me, compare the relative quality, not of the visual effects, but just as of the overall story, plot, acting, and characters of the 4 films in Star Wars that George Lucas actually directed, namely A New Hope, The Phantom Menace, Attack of the Clones, and Revenge of the Sith, to the 4 films he did not direct, namely Empire Strikes Back, Return of the Jedi, Rogue One, and The Force Awakens. The difference, as far as the overall quality, is night and day. Now, I obviously did not include The Last Jedi because, while I have no doubt that it will be a high-quality film, I have not seen it yet. Star Trek, similarly, if you look at the elements of Star Trek that were under the direct control of Gene Roddenberry, namely the original pilot, The Cage, as well as Star Trek the Motion Picture and the first season of Star Trek The Next Generation, most people consider that pretty much the worst that Trek has to offer. So both Star Trek and Star Wars have problems with their relative creators. The Star Trek creator wanted to make his franchise into a propaganda piece for communism, and in Star Wars, the creator was just an incompetent filmmaker. With the rebirth of Star Wars with Force Awakens, we unfortunately see a similar change in philosophy that we saw a bit earlier in Star Trek. Not in making Star Wars about communism, but to try and push a social agenda. J.J. Abrams himself said that he cast Daisy Ridley and John Boyega not because they fit the role as written, but in order to push a woman and a black man into the forefront. There's been talk of making the characters Finn and Poe homosexual lovers for similar reasons. And in Rogue One, it becomes painfully clear that the cast and crew does not know anything about the material that they're working with. Apparently, they did not even realize that Princess Leia was a great, strong feminist character, just based on the purely superficial aspect of her name, of all things.
How important is that to sort of represent heroes and have heroes of all colors?
Well, I think the whole idea of revisiting Star Wars is very smart, you know. This is a much more modern film in terms of, yeah, that diversity you're talking about, skin tones, accents, the role of women, you know. If you see that in the first films, it's princesses. They're not running in the field with a weapon, you know, fighting for freedom and being the stars of the film. This one, you have that. I mean,
I'm sorry, but has Diego Luna even seen a Star Wars film? But this is where we start running into problems in Hollywood these days. First and foremost is the ignorance of the creators and financiers of art, not knowing anything about the art that they are in fact creating or financing. In Star Wars, anyone who does not think that the original trilogy had a strong female lead has simply not seen the original trilogy. Just as anyone who thinks that Star Trek lacks diversity has absolutely never spent any time watching Star Trek. Now, I'm not saying that every cast and crew member of a project needs to be a fanboy of said project. However, you should at least know the basics. For example, basic facts like the center of the first 3 Star Wars films were about Luke Skywalker and his twin sister, Leia. That the 3 prequel films, while vastly inferior to the original, were about Luke and Leia's mom and dad coming together and eventually falling apart. Or, in Star Trek, the idea that the Federation believes in diversity and tolerance as being extremely valuable, and that Starfleet is the frickin' military. So, this blatant ignorance unfortunately leads us to the second core issue. The industry is bending over backwards and tripping over itself to try and fit strong female leads into large franchise projects like Rey in Star Wars and Michael in Star Trek. But, on the other hand, we have an interesting sexist double standard as to what is acceptable to portray on screen. X-Men Apocalypse was, frankly, a mess of a movie, but it had a billboard depicting the main villain holding the main hero by the neck. The poster was very effective at showing that Apocalypse was a terrifying and powerful villain. It really is too bad that the film was not as good as this poster. Mystique and the X-Men, of course, eventually won the day. However, outspoken feminists such as Rose Mcgowan, rather than celebrating the fact that X-Men has a strong female leader in Mystique fighting against overwhelming odds and inspiring others to become better and saving the day, no. Rose says that 20th Century Fox was promoting casual violence against women because of the billboard. Oh, who is Rose Mcgowan, you probably are asking? Well, she's an actress who is most well known as, that sexy biker girl who got her leg cut off and replaced with a machine gun in Planet Terror. Just let that sink in. Give it a minute. Yeah. So Hollywood is trying more and more to include strong female leads, but they cannot promote violence against women. So, what do? Enter Mary Sue. Interestingly enough, while you may have heard the term Mary Sue before, and no doubt have a good idea what the term actually means, you may not know that the term actually started in Star Trek. Well, with the Star Trek fans anyway. The term comes from a series of stories written back in the 1970s about a young 15-year-old Lieutenant Mary Sue. She was the youngest officer in Starfleet, and she had unprecedented skills at almost everything. She was loved and adored by all the rest of the crew. You get the idea. So, in the modern social justice warrior environment where women need to be a strong leader but also cannot be depicted as being victims or having violence committed against them, we get Ray and Michael, two women with men's names that routinely save the day, showing massive skills at anything and everything they do, and fighting physical hand-to-hand battles against drastically overpowering male opponents and walking away with only minor scratches. The problem is not that Star Trek or Star Wars has become too politically correct or too diverse. It's just badly written. If the main character is perfect at everything, even accidentally, it's hard to care about that character. With Rey, one of the first things she does is kick a trained stormtrooper's behind. She then has never flown the Millennium Falcon before, at least not in years, and then she accidentally performs maneuvers that would do Han and Lando proud. We then see that she knows the Falcon systems better than Han Solo himself. She again accidentally releases the monsters on Han's ship in such a perfect fashion as to allow them to escape. With zero training, she overpowers her guard with the Force, escapes on her own, and then beats a trained Force user in a lightsaber duel. The problem with Rey is not that she's a woman. She's just too perfect. Michael Burnham on Star Trek Discovery is a woman who's loved by everybody, and the first episode accidentally kills a trained Klingon warrior with his own bat'leth. Are we seeing a pattern here? Like Rey, she's an expert at, well, apparently everything, and routinely saves the day just because she has a hunch that is pretty much always right. Michael's problem, like Rey, has nothing to do with race or gender. It's about poor writing. So, is there hope for Star Trek and Star Wars? Sure. I'm looking forward to seeing The Last Jedi, and I hope it's awesome. I hope that Star Trek Discovery is great when it comes back from its fall break. But frankly, I'm not exactly optimistic about the future of either Star Trek or Star Wars, and likely will not be until it's the writers of these great franchises begin to write characters that feel human. The preceding documentary was created for the express purpose of criticism, commentary, and education, and is therefore protected under the Copyright Act of 1976, Section 107, which reads in part, the fair use of a copyrighted work, including such use by reproduction in copies or phonorecords, or by any other means specified by that section, for purposes such as criticism, comment, news reporting, teaching, including multiple copies for classroom use, scholarship, or research, is not an infringement of copyright.